Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Everybody is coming into the room. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Yay.
Welcome. As you join, if you can go ahead and in the chat, you should be able to drop a greeting in any language that you choose, your name, where you're coming to us from, whether that's a school, a district, an agency, and your role in that. You're in the panel discussion on the science of reading for multilingual learners, and we will get started in just a few moments.
Wonderful. Yay, look at everybody who's here. Doreen. Great. Salam. Sego, sego. Welcome, welcome. Look at all these great educators in the room. We're up to just about 120 right now. This is exciting. Wonderful information to share. Thank you for being here, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Fabulous. All right. Okay. Fantastic, about 122. All right. So we are limited on time because we have such amazing information and wonderful, wonderful speakers to share their ideas and perspectives. Thank you for joining this important webinar for the Delaware Department of Education, a panel discussion on the science of reading for multilingual learners. And the big question really is around, what do Delaware educators need to know about the science of reading for multilingual learners? And we have representatives here from your Department of Education, as well as experts from the field. We do not currently see Dr. Mancilla-Martinez, but not to worry, we have lots of her resources that we will be able to share. And we would like you to share your questions. The chat is open for you to interact. And please, if you have one of those questions that you need to have answered, whether it gets answered here today or not, that you put it in the Q&A, because this is the place where we will be able to center on some of those learnings that are surfacing for you and really capture those ideas in the Q&A. You can find the Q&A in your chat bar down below. Right next to chat, there's a Q&A, and then you can enter your questions there. So without further ado, I'm Melissa Lambert. I'd like to introduce the panelists today. And we have Dr. Claude Goldenberg, who really needs very little introduction, but is a fantastic resource to the field and has done a lot of research. He is a professor emeritus from the Stanford Graduate School of Nomellini and Oliver Professor of Education. And he is an author, a researcher. He has dedicated his career to leading projects focused on improving literacy for multilingual learners and English learners in elementary and middle school, language and literacy development among multilingual learners in the US and internationally. Way up high in the chat, actually, I can put it back in here now. You have these bios that you can read more as well. And we included some pertinent and relevant articles for each of them, but all are very, very well published. Dr. Christina Buddy, who is Delaware. Dr. Christina Buddy is an assistant professor specializing in language and literacy education at the School of Education, University of Delaware. She began her career as an elementary school teacher and seeks to understand classroom practices and contexts that build upon cultural and linguistic diversity of students, as well as promote social and emotional well-being. Also a topic that has rung true for the conference today as we move from surviving to thriving. Her research focuses on this language and literacy in early childhood, elementary age students from diverse backgrounds, and she teaches courses related to literacy instruction and multilingual learners. And of course, also not needing too much introduction, the amazing Margaret Goldberg, a literacy coach in a large urban district in California. She has held a variety of roles, including teacher, district early literacy lead, site-based literacy coach, reading interventionist, and in every role, she has worked to help schools and districts align instruction and reading research. She is the co-founder of the Right to Read Project, a group of teachers, researchers, and activists committed to the pursuit of equity through literacy. There are relevant readings and information that you can learn about, as well as digging more into American Public Media report At a Loss for Words that was featured much of Margaret Goldberg's work. And we appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for being here. As you'll be hearing from everybody extensively throughout this wonderful session, I'm going to hand it over to Paige, who's going to talk a little bit about the context for Delaware, and then we'll hear from panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Tuesday. I'm Paige Morgan. I'm the Elementary ELA and Literacy Education Associate at the department. I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation today and to hear from this panel of amazing experts working in the field. This work is so important as we want to ensure that we are supporting all of our students and educators in Delaware. So before we begin the panel discussion, I'm going to provide the state's definition of the science of reading. And the Delaware Department of Education has adopted the Reading League's definition of the science of reading as being a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. This research has been conducted over the last 5 decades across the world and is derived from thousands of studies in multiple fields conducted in multiple languages. The science of reading has culminated in a preponderance of evidence to inform how proficient reading and writing develop, why some have difficulty, and how we can most effectively assess and teach, and therefore improve student outcomes through prevention of and intervention for reading difficulties. It encompasses the foundational skills to include phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and oral language. And unfortunately, the science of reading has been often interpreted too narrowly as exclusively focused on phonological awareness and phonics. And we know that there are other factors that are critical for literacy development, including those that address language, meaning, and communication and knowledge, which are all necessary to comprehend what we read. So now that we've shared DOE's definition of the science of reading, I will also share an important legislative update. Thank you, Melissa. So as you may or may not know, we have had several pieces of early literacy legislation pass and get signed by our governor over the last several months. And one of those pieces is Senate Bill 4. So Delaware Senate Bill 4 requires the Delaware Department of Education to maintain a published list of evidence-based reading curriculum from grades K to 3 that align with the essential components of literacy. The list will be provided in our publisher profiles by the end of May this school year and will be housed on our early literacy website. We will be providing this information for districts and charters to make informed decisions related to the adoption of high quality instructional materials. And additionally, by the 2027-2028 school year, Delaware school districts and charters serving students in grades K through 3 must adopt high quality instructional materials from the department's list, demonstrate that all educators who provide reading instruction to students in grades K to 3 participate in competency-based professional learning that's also grounded in the science of reading, and identify an individual responsible for assisting with the implementation of the curriculum and reporting process. So as a part of this work, we currently are working with our curriculum publishers to describe how supports for multilingual learners are embedded throughout their curriculum and what professional learning they provide to educators on best practices for supporting multilingual learners. We're also closely reviewing the content of our early literacy professional learning vendors to see how supports are embedded in trainings that our teachers and educators and administrators are participating in. We've been very busy over the last several months working with our curriculum publishers, members of our districts and charters, and other stakeholders to continue to support Delaware's educators as we move forward with our work in early literacy. So thank you, and it's my pleasure to turn it back over to Melissa for our panel discussion this afternoon.
Thank you so much. And you know what, it was really important, and I hope participants gathered this, that Paige and the ELA department, the elementary ELA department, are working hand in hand with your multilingual learner experts and leaders at the Department of Education. And that is so important and unique because they're working on this together. This is a shared responsibility and also a shared learning experience. So really powerful work happening at the Department of Ed in regards to collaboration. So thank you, Paige. That was exciting. So let's dig in. This is a three-part panel, if you will, and then a component that we've added that's like, what's the aspiration, right? So you have policy happening in the state of Delaware. You have the science of reading, the definition of the science of reading. Where does that leave multilingual learners in practice? What do we need to know, and what do we need to avoid or be aware of? And we'll start with this. What perspective do you bring? What does the science of reading mean to you? And Christina, you're right at the top of my squares here. So let's start with you.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here today and to represent Delaware. So as we know, as I know Margaret and Claude are going to speak to, the science of reading has been around for decades. It's not new. It really refers to the sum of what we know about how people learn to read. However, every few years, it seems to be that people come in and they tell teachers that everything they know is no longer working. And they often tell teachers to implement new programs or practices or curriculum that completely changes the focus of their instruction. And it often, these new programs, if we think about that proverbial pendulum swinging one way or the other, it often causes us to focus our instruction so narrowly that it causes a new set of issues or a new set of problems. And I saw this firsthand when I first started teaching in the early 2000s. You know, we had the reading first initiatives, and then it was followed by a resurgence of balanced literacy. So even in my decade or so of teaching in elementary school, I constantly saw this pendulum swinging. And that's what we're seeing now again. Many are arguing that in current public discourse, the science of reading movement has been around, being promoted, I should say, by some educators, reformers, and now it's even reaching policymakers. And mainly, as it was mentioned, it's to argue that explicit phonics instruction is key to the development of one's literacy skills. And I really worry about that when it comes to our multilingual learners, because it's such a narrow focus that draws upon a very limited scope of a very comprehensive science of reading research. And it's mainly related to word level decoding skills. And that excludes very important elements about what we know when it comes to reading with multilingual learners, such as cross-linguistic transfer and language comprehension. And specifically, the perspective that I bring is I have the pleasure of spending most of my days working with pre-service teachers, and I saw many of them join us here today. And I teach our elementary teacher education majors in literacy courses, and I also teach language development and ESL methods courses for our ETE majors receiving dual certification in ESL. And as my students are learning about the science of reading and implementing the components of the science of reading, I've also learned over the past few years that my students need support in identifying and applying the components of the science of reading, which makes sense because most of them were in elementary school during that resurgence of the balanced literacy wave. So depending on the schools they attended or the school districts they were in, they received very different instruction. So a lot of times I hear from my students, Dr. Buddy, counting phonemes is really hard, or using morphology to decode words is very challenging for me. So over the past few years, what I've realized is that in addition to teaching the pedagogy that supports the science of reading, understanding how students typically progress along a continuum of reading development, I've also had to explicitly teach the essential components that make up the science of reading. And I'm absolutely fine with that, because just admitting that you need some help can be very difficult for us. And so if I need to build in more time and opportunities for my pre-service teachers to practice phonology and morphology, et cetera, then so be it. Because after all, how can we expect pre-service teachers to go out into schools and assess and teach the components of the science of reading if they don't understand them? So to me, understanding and implementing the science of reading requires teachers to really reflect upon and build their own knowledge and teaching practice.
Thank you. You're getting like major reactions here with emojis. I didn't even know that was a thing. That's amazing.
Lots of love,
so
Christina.
cool.
Lots of love.
We are so advanced right now. I want to welcome Jeannette Mancilla-Martinez too. Thank you so much for being here. Can't wait to hear from you. We'll let you settle in, and I'll bump it over to Claude. Thank you, Christina, Dr. Buddy.
Thanks, Melissa. And thanks to everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm just overwhelmed by all the love you're getting, Christina. That you've set a very high standard. So I don't know. I'm not in the competition, but I don't know if I'm going to get any hearts, but that's all right. Be that as it may. I'm excited to be here with you. Thanks, Melissa, and your Delaware colleagues for organizing this. I'm going to take a little bit different tack, because I got to tell you the truth. When I hear the term science of reading, I kind of get the creeps, because it's become a lightning rod. People who are in favor of science of reading, sometimes, I suspect inadvertently, but functionally, as Christina mentioned, and also as Paige mentioned, there's sort of a narrowing down. It's kind of like the phonological skills forward. That tends to get a lot of attention, and they deserve a lot of attention. Don't get me wrong. And then the people who are, let's call them science reading skeptics, tend to narrow down science reading to be all about phonics. So here we go again with phonics. So, we've seen this movie before. What is now called Science of Reading, 20 years ago, we heard reading first mentioned. 20 years ago, it's called SBRR, Scientifically Based Reading Research. And the term old wine, new bottles keeps coming up in my mind. And I think the problem is we use labels very imprecisely and not very helpfully. So science of reading, which means different things to different people, unless they're either arguing for it or arguing against it, in which case they tend to take a very narrow view of what it is, can be just about anything. And I want to refer to the definition of science of reading that is pretty well known, a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research, et cetera, which comes to us from the Reading League. Now, I find this definition, while not incorrect, completely useless, because it doesn't have any substance to it. It tells you a set of activities and what people have done. Exactly what Christina was referring to. You got to get into the components. What does it actually mean in terms of what people should be thinking about and doing? And in fact, I think what Paige said I bet people didn't realize that after reading this long and rather wordy definition, Paige actually said some stuff that was really informative about what the science of reading is, that phonological skills are extremely important. She didn't say don't leave home without them, but I'll tell you, don't leave home without them. It's only at your and your students' risk, but there's a lot more involved. She actually talked about the components, what we're talking about when we talk about the science of reading. I wish we could flip the definition and have what Paige said be the definition of science of reading. And then if anyone's interested, put in a footnote that it's a vast interdisciplinary, et cetera, because this really doesn't tell us anything. So it's a scientific enterprise, true, which means different things to different people, which is legitimate. What is the most useful source of information, how you design the studies, those are all important, sometimes technical issues that make people's eyes glaze over. But if I had one wish in this conversation, that we drop the use of science of reading, and I've got an alternative, LKB, literacy knowledge base. That's what we're really talking about. What is the knowledge base for teaching literacy? Reading's important, but we have a more expansive view of what we're talking about, which is literacy. So we need, instead of SOR, LKB, the literacy knowledge base. What has been found? What are the key concepts? What do we have to keep in mind if we want to take advantage of what the literacy knowledge base has afforded to us as professionals, as educators, as researchers? What do we have to keep in mind in order to put that knowledge forward? Because then we're going to talk about the science of teaching reading, which is not exactly the same thing as science of reading. And I suspect we'll get into that later on, and I can't wait to hear what Christina and Margaret have to say about that.
Beautiful, Margaret.
Well, how to follow that up? I'd say that the science of reading is what was missing from my teacher preparation program. It was missing from the curriculum that my district purchased and provided to me. It was missing from most of the trainings that I received as a classroom teacher, interventionist, as a literacy coach. I didn't come upon the science of reading until I was at least a decade into teaching. And I found it in journals and in publications that weren't actually intended for teachers. That's actually changed quite a bit in the last 5 to 7 years or so. But the way I'd summarize the science of reading is that it's the scientific study of how reading develops, why it's challenging to learn, and then what the qualities are of instruction that ensure that the greatest number of children will become successful readers. And that last part is the part that I, as a teacher, focus on the most. What qualities of instruction need to be in place so that most of our children are able to become successful readers?
Beautiful. Dr. Martinez, Mancilla-Martinez.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeannette Mancilla-Martinez. Pleasure to be here. And this is a big question and one that I think about a lot. And so to just kind of get right to it, to me, I think I'm very aligned. And sorry, I didn't get to hear everything of what Christina had to say when I logged on, but I heard Claude and obviously Margaret. And I agree with what has been said so far. I do appreciate that there has been a lot of controversy and it's been very politicized in many ways, the concept of the science of reading. And the perspective that I bring is really about the essential components of what we need for students to have the best chance at being successful at the task of understanding the print that they are reading. And so the language component to me is so central when I think about the science of reading, which I don't think is a view that many, or at least those that are kind of opposed to the science of reading, think about. I think there's a big focus on the phonics side, which is a piece of the puzzle. You cannot have reading comprehension without being able to read the printed words. So it's non-negotiable that you develop those word level skills, but that cannot be devoid of the meaning-making component. And I think that's a part of the more comprehensive understanding that I think about when I think of the science of reading, and really thinking about the knowledge development. And that component is no one's fault. And this is not about finger pointing or blaming, but I think in terms of teacher prep programs in particular, as a field, we have not done a good enough job of providing the kind of curriculum, let's say, that is needed so that students are simultaneously developing the conceptual background knowledge that they need so that when they do apply these phonics decoding-based skills to the task of reading the text, they are actually being able to extract meaning from what they are reading. And so I hope science of reading is not synonymous with an educational fad or a single curriculum, like I said, or a one-size-fits-all approach. At least that's not my understanding as a kind of sterile recipe-like skill and drill, but really about encompassing the components And there has been a lot that definitely predates me in terms of what we have learned about what it means to become a skilled reader and what it takes. When we, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but when we think about subgroups of students in the US who struggle comparatively more than others, like students from multilingual backgrounds or lower income backgrounds, a lot of these are confounded factors anyways that we can talk about later. There's even a bigger urgency in my mind to really make sure that teachers are equipped with the knowledge base that they need to do the best job they can in a systematic way to ensure that students are developing the word reading skills. And like I said, I'm going to keep honing this in to develop the language knowledge that they need as well. So I'll pause there.
Melissa, could I call out one of the comments in the chat that I just want to briefly, would that be okay? Am I stepping out of line here? Melissa? Uh-oh.
Not at all. You go right ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, Mary Finch has an interesting comment. I've been teaching for 30 years. Science of reading has changed so many times. I worry about one side versus the other side, science. And why can't it be both? Well, the answer, it is both. And the problem is that we talk about it in such an opaque way that it almost people feel like they have to take sides. I mean, it is both. It's the word recognition part, and it's the comprehension language part. The trick is how those two intersect, how you teach them. You can't teach everything at once, so you got to strategize and take things. So it's complicated for sure, but it is both. And by talking about it in opaque terms, it seems to be a dichotomy when it is not a dichotomy.
That's really setting us up well, both of you, for this particular question, right? Because it's whatever we're calling it. I really liked how you framed it earlier, Claude, but this notion of the science of reading, well, there's also a science of teaching and a science of learning. So what do we need to know about teaching reading to multilingual learners? What do we need to know and what do we need to avoid? Christina, let's bump back to you.
You see it all the love, right?
That's right. It was all those hearts that made that happen.
So this is a really interesting question, and I've been working on this question a lot. So with my colleague here at UD, Steve Amendum, and one of our amazing doc students, Sean Kittle, we've actually been engaging in a systematic review of systematic reviews. So we've dug deep into the research that looks at second language learning and acquisition and the science of reading. And using just over 30 systematic reviews, we were able to draw two major conclusions when it comes to the SOR for ML specifically. The first conclusion is that there are a number of evidence-based components related to English reading comprehension that create this enhanced, I call it an enhanced science of reading, but I like enhanced LKB for MLs. And although the research does show that English phonological awareness and decoding are important evidence-based components of this SOR for MLs, there are many additional components that make it up as well, including English oral language, oral proficiency, and vocabulary. L1, specifically the studies we looked at, Spanish decoding, English oral reading fluency, L1 reading comprehension and strategic reading, as well as English comprehension strategies. And second, we looked at the instructional practices. So now we're looking at how do these components actually work in the classroom with MLs. We looked at practices, programs, and interventions that had significantly positive results for addressing each of these components. And what we learned, just broadly, some of those practices that rose to the top were use of the student's home language, direct and explicit instruction in English reading skills and strategies, peer-mediated and cooperative instruction, and enhanced instruction where teachers incorporate ML targeted scaffolds like videos or structured writing. And there was also very strong evidence for the use of a multi-component reading instruction. So all of this is to say is that we know a lot about how we can the science of reading, a lot about the components of the science of reading for MLs and how to teach these components. There's still a lot of work to do, but we do know a lot so far. So I'll be interested to see what my colleagues have to share as well. Thanks.
Great. Margaret, you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. I think this panel has already done a really good job of naming the fact that a lot of attention has been paid to the word reading side of things. And I just want to be really clear, Claude also articulated it, that was for good reason, because there's been a lot of confusion about the role of meaning and of syntax in reading. Balanced literacy thought of those as viable alternatives to decoding, and they're not. So balanced literacy materials got phonics instruction very wrong. And parents of children who were having difficulty learning how to decode started to realize their power as advocates. So we've heard a lot from the dyslexic families of dyslexic students. But balanced literacy was also really wrong about the role of language development in reading and comprehension. So typical balanced literacy instruction doesn't support explicit instruction in academic language. It doesn't teach explicitly and systematically vocabulary or grammar or shifting registers. It doesn't give a lot of guidance for written composition other than students should be producing a lot of writing. So we should be really concerned about kids who aren't getting the instruction that they need in order to acquire academic English in balanced literacy classrooms. So I think the greatest challenge in the field is trying to support teachers with language comprehension instruction. Most teachers haven't been equipped with the knowledge and the tools that they need in order to explain to kids how English works. And we need to be able to teach children who aren't able to use the question, does that sound right, as their primary guide when they're learning to read and write.
Wow, Claude, do you have any feedback on that?
Well, you mean other than just agreeing that Christina and Margaret are 120% right? Let me just add a couple of comments. One is, I hope you'll put in the chat the literature review that Christina mentioned, which I had a chance to take a look at. You know, I got it a couple of weeks ago. It's super useful, and I think it's a real contribution. You know, let me just try to sum it up in a sort of a simple kind of bumper sticker way. And that is that everything that we know about teaching reading to kids who know the language already, you know, English speakers, also applies to teaching reading to kids who are learning the language as they're learning to read it. The difference is that the kids who are learning to read in the language, they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand, need additional supports, primarily in the language domain, vocabulary, language, background knowledge, but particularly in the words and texts that are being used to teach them to read. Now, when you teach a child, or an adult for that matter, it's the same thing. When you're teaching someone to read, typically you're using words that are already in their spoken vocabulary, right? In beginning reading, you run, see, I. These are words that in any normally developing English speaking individual, they already know the meanings of those words. So they can do the kind of thing I think that Margaret was alluding to. You want to teach reading by teaching decoding, you know, phonics skills, but then having the individual think, does that make sense? Now, if you know the language that you're reading, then that's relatively straightforward. Sometimes you got to get prompted to do it because a lot of times kids get hung up on sounds and symbols and don't realize they're reading something that makes sense. So you got to prompt them with, okay, do you know that word? Does it make sense there? You know, not all at once, there's a sequence. Read a word using your decoding skills, then think, does that make sense? If you know the words, it's relatively straightforward. If you don't know the words, it's not straightforward. In fact, you can't do it, which is why you need ELD specifically targeted at helping individuals who are simultaneously learning the language know the meaning of the words they are reading, so that when they code them, they can ask themselves with prompt and scaffolds from the teacher as appropriate. That's part of the teaching process. Does that word make sense? Do you know that word? Does it make sense in the context? And at that point, they can use pictures to understand the context, but you can't use words, pictures, letters indiscriminately, as the balanced literacy folks have proposed. It's a very bad way of teaching reading. In fact, it's counterproductive because it teaches some very, very bad habits. So let me just make one more comment about balanced literacy, because balanced literacy in its common use is exactly what Margaret described and has exactly those problems. But ironically, the term balanced literacy was used in the National Reading Panel over 20 years ago, nearly a quarter of a century ago. I was there when that was put out. And the term balanced literacy for the National Reading Panel meant, guess what? Not 3Qing, not choose randomly which cues you want to bounce off of to read words, but balanced literacy meant you teach foundational skills, phonological awareness, phonics, decoding, all that. But at the same time, at other parts of the day, or when it's appropriate, you teach oral language, you teach vocabulary, you have, guess what? Read alouds that are way beyond the reading skill of students. So they get the language, they get the oral language, they get the vocabulary, they get the background knowledge. That is balanced literacy. Unfortunately, balanced literacy has been sort of hijacked, and I would say, excuse me, I don't mean to be rude, but perverted by people who have a completely wrong theory about how literacy is acquired. I think we should go back to the original meaning of balanced literacy. Read the National Reading Panel report. If you don't know where that passage is, email me and I'll send you the quote.
Beautiful. Dr. Mancilla-Martinez, you really started us off on this by talking about your perspective on the science of reading and started to mention some of the emphasis on the components of teaching and what the research tells us about that. Any thoughts about this from your perspective?
Yeah, definitely have some thoughts. So let's see if I can pare them down to just a few. So I'll first start off by saying, once again, an agreement with what has been said, certainly about the bolstering the language comprehension side of the science of reading, to continue using that term given the presentations today and the panelists. But I do want to mention a couple of things. I wrote some notes because I will forget because I'm hearing such great thoughts and ideas. So one of them is that and it'll be interesting to see what others have to say about this, but I do think that it can be very tricky, for lack of a better word, to rely on using students' first language in the service of their English reading comprehension. And I say that super cautiously because this is my line of work in the sense that I focus on students whose first language is not English. That is the developmental trajectory I had as a child of Mexican parents who immigrated to the US. So what I mean by that is absolutely not to take that out of context and say, let's not use the first language, but just that there continue to be a lot of myths and misconceptions about the population of multilingual learners in the US. So I would, if the question is, what does the research tell us and what do we need to know, avoid? One thing I always like to underscore is that I think the educator workforce, and that includes professors in academic settings, need to have a better understanding of who this population is, as opposed to these kind of stereotypical characterizations of multilingual learners as newly arrived immigrants who essentially have no English language skills. Are there students who fit that profile? Of course, but that's not the vast majority of multilingual learners in the US. So I think that part is like a 101 imperative. And I'd also, very much in line with that, think that it's important to avoid the at-risk characterization that is just so common when we think about multilingual learners. And the words that we tend to think about is the challenges of working with this population. And speaking more than one language is not a problem, is not a challenge, is not a handicap. On the contrary, but that's just not the mindset that we have. And I know that sounds a little bit preachy, but I think it's really important if we're going to if we're going to continue to do what we've always done, everyone knows you're going to get what you've always gotten. And so I think those components are so important for the educator workforce who is charged with this huge task of helping these children develop language and reading skills to get right. And there is, I'm going to stop soon, but there is a very, in my mind, inequitable screening process just in terms of how you identify this specific subgroup called English learners. And I think we've all kind of mentioned this in some way, shape, or form, that there tends to be a heavier focus on the word reading side, the phonics side of things, as opposed to language development and knowledge development. And part of the issue has to do with our limitations at the assessment level and the lack of assessments to really track their language comprehension knowledge. The one time we really do this is at school entry when parents fill out the home language survey. And if a language other than English in some form is noted as being spoken, then it's a red flag that you may not have the adequate academic English language skills. If it's yes, 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 English only, what is the assumption? That you have the adequate English language skills. And that is unfortunately, because it would be great if it was true, unfortunately not true. And so at the very beginning of the educational experience, we have these inequities, because I haven't conducted the study. I've been wanting to do it, and just, anecdotally and accidentally, students who are quote unquote monolingual English speakers or English only speakers have taken these kinds of English language proficiency assessments. And as you might imagine, they have not passed the minimum threshold. So they would effectively be considered English learners. So I'll kind of stop there.
Wow, that was great. Thank you for sharing that.
That actually happened in California, Jeanette. There was a study done, as you're probably familiar with, of English speakers who could not pass as English proficient.
Yeah,
The
I
self
am.
is being used. So your comments are just right on the money.
Incredible. And really important to wrap into this notion about research, because there are opportunities that we have to increase the research and really help to enlighten this true support, right? So you heard a little bit about the policy in Delaware. Paige kicked us off with talking about Senate Bill 4 SB 4 for the state of Delaware. We want to pose this question, and Dr. Buddy, if you could lead us off, what are the implications of policy for the science of reading for multilingual learners, particularly in Delaware, with your great perspective?
Yeah, so thinking specifically about Delaware, and specifically the required use of the HQIM materials for literacy instruction, I really see a lot of opportunity here. I know that sometimes we're handed a curriculum and we think, oh my goodness, this isn't working for my students, this isn't meeting the needs of my multilingual learners. But I actually see that there's a chance for us to think about this a little differently. So we honestly know, that most curricula do not address the specific academic and linguistic needs of our MLs, as some of the other panelists have already mentioned. And to do so would actually be incredibly difficult to develop, because it would need to be so context dependent on the specific students being served. So it would have to take into considerations, I believe Jeannette was just talking about this, like with their L1, their literacy levels in the L1, our own state standards here in Delaware, as well as numerous sociocultural factors. However, in Delaware, that list of HQIM is relatively small, which means that there are multiple school districts using the same HQIM, and we often have very similar demographics of students across these school districts because we're a very small state. And to me, I see this as a great opportunity for collaboration in our state. And I know that the state has been working very hard to support more opportunities for collaboration. And what I see, or what I could envision happening in our state, is that if school districts come together, so for example, all the school districts using core knowledge come together and they put our MLs first in this collaboration, and we collaboratively identify the affordances that our MLs are bringing to the classroom, and then we identify the specifics about what is it that our students need to be successful meeting the grade level standards using this particular curriculum that we're required to use. And then we target the learning needs of our MLs by providing these specific supports and scaffolds that the panelists have talked about to meet the various ELP levels. And then we share this widely through professional learning with classroom teachers. So we can collaboratively take what we know about the enhanced science of reading for MLs, and we can map it right on top of what our teachers in Delaware are already using and already doing. So it's not an extra to do, it's a resource to make what exists already better. And I see that teachers often need support in how to scaffold learning to make it accessible for our MLs. So when experts in ESL and grade level content come together in this way, we have that saying, many hands make light work, but it would have a huge impact on student learning.
Fabulous. Margaret, what are your thoughts on this?
I love this future that Christina is describing, because what happened for me as a teacher in California during the first wave of, as Claude was talking about, SBRR programs, a lot of efforts were done to try to bypass the teacher. The thought was, if we create a curriculum and we hand the curriculum to teachers and we tell teachers, teach this, and then we follow up by monitoring teachers to make sure that they are teaching that, then we'll get the outcomes that we want. And that absolutely doesn't work for thousands of reasons. But I'm going to just say the primary reason is that it's the gray area between the curriculum, the teacher, and the student that ends up mattering most. It's those impromptu moments of opportunities for learning. It's the dialogue that unfolds that's not scripted out in the teacher's manual. It's the knowledge that kids are bringing to the particular topic. It's the teacher's enthusiasm about the topic that they're teaching. All of those things are the things that result in really high quality education that results in the outcomes that we want. So I think one of the things that we need to think about when we're thinking about policies related to the science of reading is how are we involving teachers as professionals into this work so that they're able to work together as other professions do, going to conferences, meeting with each other, collaborating with each other, getting feedback, receiving professional coaching in a way that's really respectful and that allows them to thrive in the teaching that they've always been wanting to deliver.
Beautiful. Claude?
Yes, the gray areas. How do you legislate and make policies around the gray areas? One of the many $64,000 questions. The short answer is, I don't know, but don't ignore it. If you do, you're just, destined for failure. And I think the kind of things that Margaret and Christina are talking about are absolutely essential. But if we could back up to a simpler question, like how to formulate policy, the first step, I think, in formulating policy is to replace the definition of science of reading that was shown first and replace it with what Paige said. Because what Paige said was just so much more informative and so much more useful, right? So if you build policy around programs, policies, and practices that put forward exactly the kind of things that Paige laid out, I think you'd be closer to formulating policy that people actually understand what you're talking about. And when you just invoke the science of reading, you're just dealing in opaque language. So begin with a definition of what you're talking about that communicates something consequential, something of substance. And at the moment, I'd like to see Paige's definition in writing, because I'd like to use it at some point, because that speaks. And then once you do that, say you want programs and policies that put this into action. Now, I've been involved in discussions out here in California with a particular bill having to do with early screening. And one of the ways you can get into trouble, especially in California, but I suspect in other parts of the country as well, is you propose a bill, early screening for dyslexia. Now, it turns out that early screening for dyslexia can get you into trouble because dyslexia evokes things, particularly for advocates for multilingual learners, is very unpleasant. Many, many, many multilingual learners have been misdiagnosed as dyslexic because the language proficiency has been confounded with acquisition of reading skills. So you touch a raw nerve when you propose a bill to screen early for dyslexia. For starters, you cannot diagnose or identify dyslexia in kindergarten. It cannot be done. And this is not me talking, because I'm not a dyslexia expert, but real experts, people like Jack Fletcher or Elsa Hagen-Cardenas, who many of you probably know, Elsa Cardenas-Hagen. She's a dyslexia expert, and you can't diagnose in kindergarten. So what should you do? Choose a word that is more meaningful and less volatile, like reading difficulties. You want to screen early for potential reading difficulties, but we get mired in the vocabulary that just sets off rockets in opposition without thinking about, is this really the best way to communicate what we're trying to advocate? Then the other problem is that what actually belongs in legislation. Some people think you can't get too detailed, the kind of things that Margaret and Christina were proposing, and I suspect Jeannette agrees with, and it's difficult to put those things into legislation for sure, and even into policy documents for state departments of education. It doesn't mean I don't think they're important, and if we can figure out a way to make them into policy, make those gray areas that Margaret was talking about into policy, I'd be all for it. But I'm not a legislator. I don't write legislative language. I just keep hearing you can't put all that kind of stuff in a piece of legislation, and it's hard enough to put it even in State Department of Education policies. So I'm all for getting a handle on those, but for the moment, I'd be satisfied if we could just put in the legislation meaningful words that communicate something of substance and then try to get around how we actually make that into the classroom, because ultimately that's what we need to do. But we got to start with meaningful communication from policymakers to educators, and then from educators, which includes teachers, obviously, back to the legislators. Otherwise, this opaque language is, we're just going to always be chasing our tails, I'm afraid.
That's true. Before we get into the last part of this, which is the aspirations, what do we do if we get this right? What does it look like if we get this right? Jeannette, what is your feeling about this policy question?
Oh man, so much to say, and such great things have been said already. So I took notes again because then I forget. So for one thing, as far as I understand in terms of the policy context in Delaware, by no means do I have expertise and know that super well, but the idea of the universal reading screenings that would happen 3 times a year, as I understand it, seems fantastic to me, with the caveat that I hope it does not focus only on word level skills, right? We've talked about this mismatch in terms of what we're assessing, and related to, I mean, because the idea would be for intervention, and by intervention, I mean the kind of instructional supports that students would need so that they don't fall further behind and that they keep up with their, grade level peers. So that seems like a good idea, assuming that the assessment battery is robust enough and comprehensive enough and not just focus on word level skills. The other piece, as I understand it, is the evidence-based reading instruction curriculum, which seems great to me. But what I wanted to get to, and Claude mentioned this already, so this is a perfect connection, is about this whole intersection of language and special education status, as it relates, of course, to multilingual learners in particular. It is a very hotly debated area of research with mixed findings of overrepresentation, underrepresentation, shifting representation across disability categories. But I'm going to focus here on SLD, which is specific learning disabilities, because that subsumes reading difficulties, including but not exclusive to dyslexia. So it's not one and the same. And I agree, Claude, with the whole difficulty of using certain terminology and whatnot. But there is evidence that you can, at minimum, have a general understanding of early predictors of later reading comprehension difficulties. And I'm talking about, like Claude said, reading difficulties, not a specific thing like dyslexia, but reading difficulties. So I think it becomes really important when we think about the policy domain as it relates to multilingual learners and their reading development to focus more on what is happening with how we identify students that actually have a reading-based learning difficulty, or it's related more to, and if they're not mutually exclusive, or these students need more time to develop English language skills if the outcome is English reading comprehension, let's say. So that is an area that I have been really focused on over the last couple of years in the state of Tennessee. And I mentioned that because Tennessee is one of these, and people love and hate certain terms, but often referred to as the American South, a new immigrant destination state, which is very different than my native California, where I was born and raised, where it's a historical EL destination state, right? And so that the reason that it's important, this distinction of new immigrant or whatever you want to call it, is just that on average, the educator workforce is probably not as equipped or as accustomed to teaching a population that is linguistically diverse. So that brings with it all sorts of potential areas of growth that are needed and the part of the educator workforce, if that makes sense. We're going to talk about that some more tomorrow, so I won't say too much there, but I just want to really point out that it is so challenging to really disentangle language difference from language disorder. And I mention that because reading is language-based. And so I think that's one of the bigger policy kind of areas that I think about when I think about reading development, reading comprehension specifically, and multilingual learners.
Wow, thank you so much. For everybody has such comprehensive perspectives on each of these questions, and there's a lot we need to know still and some things we need to avoid. I think planning for more conversations around this topic will be necessary. That's what we gather here. But what does it look like? What does it look like if we rewind to being handed curriculum and saying, just do this, it's got it all, it's got everything you need? what if we get it right this time? Margaret, could you start us off on this?
Yeah, I mean, if we get it right this time, then we'll have schools and districts that are actually ready to support teachers in providing effective instruction. So teachers would be able to provide instruction that's strong in word recognition, but also in language development and in reading comprehension. So in my mind, if we get it right, it means teachers and students both realize their potential. I think one of the things that we need to focus on is the opportunity to build up school structures so that there's data collected, there's deployment of interventions, there's family engagement. There are all of the components that actually allow evidence-based differentiated instruction to happen in the classroom so that teachers aren't on their own trying to figure out what to do with a program that is handed to them. Instead, it's a collaborative experience that everyone in their various roles in the school district and in the state are engaged in.
Beautiful. Thank you. That very systemic pieces. Dr. Buddy?
I believe if we get it right, we incentivize collaboration and professional learning opportunities so that we increase the number of minutes per day that our multilingual learners spend with teachers, just like Margaret talked about, meeting the needs, the specific linguistic needs of academic learners. And we provide appropriate scaffolds and supports. And ultimately, not only then are we supporting student achievement, but we're able to support teacher self-efficacy and effectiveness as well.
Wow. Claude?
So I like to begin with the end in mind, as I think Stephen Covey said. And if we get it right, then the vast majority of kids will be reading and writing competently, joyfully, functionally. And that's when we know we're getting it right.
I guess I'm next, right?
That's I was unmuted.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I completely agree with Claude. That's where I was going to the end in mind. And ultimately, I think if we get this right, it's that you will see basically this opportunity, because I don't like the achievement gap, but this opportunity gap just eliminated. And at the end of the day, post high school graduation, multilingual learners who have choices about what they want to do and positive life outcomes. And I think that would be a marker of success.
That's incredible. And it's true. There are so many opportunities that we have, and you have surfaced so many of them. I'm so glad we've captured this, because from thinking about what the research says to where we go now, Delaware's in a position where it's so what now what, right? There's lots of policy, there's lots of high quality instructional materials. The things that you surfaced, if we're to summarize in a few notes, are I love your wording around this: incentivize collaboration. Earlier in the day, 4 Delaware districts came together to talk about their systemic approach to understanding implementation. And I think you also echo that here, that it's not just one side of the house working on this, it's everybody together, and knowing what the research says, being willing to be vulnerable and learn new things, and to investigate, and I hate to use this language, but interrogate what you don't know, so that you're centering multilingual learners and really being intentional about the work, because our students deserve it, and so do our educators. For all of you being here today, we thank you for your time well spent planning this. The conversation is just so amazing and so rich, and there were a lot of agreements, which is great. And there's also a lot of things that were named that need to be further investigated. I think that's hopefully where the field is headed, right? Right down to what we're going to start calling the science of reading as we move forward, right? Everyone, this has been a pleasure to help moderate. Thank you, Department of Education in Delaware, all of the panelists, Paige Morgan for your kickoff, brilliant minds. Thank you, participants. Hey, if you want to get some more questions answered, you can stick around in our next session, which is the close. and Dr. Goldenberg will be there. Carrie just dropped the link in there. And if you want to head over to that link, we're going to have a reflection session where we'll be able to do breakout rooms and think about all of your learning throughout the day. Panelists, thank you. You're all
Thank you,
amazing.
Melissa. Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Thanks, panel. So Melissa, should I hang out here or is there another link I need to get?
There's another link, and let me put that. Are you able to see the chat?
I am. Yeah, I see
Okay.
one from Carrie, our last
Yep.
session.
Did you see that one from Carrie? Yeah.
Should I go to that?
Yeah, go to that.
Okay, well, actually I can't because then it'll shut me off of here.
That's okay. I'm going to shut this one down. I just want to make
I'll
sure.
head
you-
over there.
Yeah,
I've dropped it lots of times because it keeps getting like pushed up in the chat.
it does. That's
Well,
good. Lots
maybe,
of
you
people.
know what? It's not letting me join because I think I have to shut down.
Oh,
here.
okay. Let me end this one. As long as you can copy the link, and if not, I'll email you the link.
Yeah, actually, I can't. I can't copy chats for some reason.
Okay, I will send it to you in your email.
Would you please? Okay,
Yep.
all right.
You got it.
See you in a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See everybody there.
Thanks, Paige.
That's all.